The whiskey on her father's breath could have stripped paint off a barn door, and Sarah knew before he even grabbed her arm that he had gambled away everything they owned again. It was spring of 1876 in Deadwood, Dakota Territory, and the gold rush had brought every kind of man west, including the worst kind. Her father, Marcus Webb, had once been a respectable freight hauler back in Missouri, but the bottle had gotten its claws into him after her mother died of fever 3 years prior. Sarah had watched him deteriorate from a grieving husband into something she barely recognized, a hollow shell of a man who cared more about his next drink than his own daughter. She was 20 years old now, old enough to know better than to hope he would change, but young enough to still feel the sting of disappointment every time he proved her right. The canvas tent they called home on the outskirts of town was barely standing, patched with whatever scraps she could find, and their supplies had dwindled to almost nothing. Sarah had been taking in mending work from the saloon girls, her fingers raw from pushing needles through thick fabric by candlelight, trying to earn enough to buy flour and beans. But every coin she managed to save, her father found and drank away. "Get up," he slurred that morning, yanking her from the thin bedroll where she had finally fallen asleep after working until dawn. "We are going into town." "Pa, I need to finish Mrs. Henderson's dress," Sarah protested, pushing her dark hair out of her eyes. "She is paying me $2 for it, and we need that money for food." "I said get up." His voice turned mean, and she knew better than to argue when he got like this. She had a fading bruise on her shoulder from the last time she had pushed back. Sarah pulled on her boots, the soles worn so thin she could feel every rock through them, and followed her father down the muddy street into the heart of Deadwood. The town was alive with activity even at this early hour, miners heading to their claims, wagons rolling through carrying supplies, and the ever-present sound of hammers and saws as new buildings went up seemingly overnight. The air smelled of pine smoke, horse manure, and the underlying scent of desperation that seemed to cling to every boom town. Her father led her straight to the Lucky Strike saloon, and Sarah's stomach dropped. Nothing good ever happened when he brought her to a saloon. She tried to hang back, but his grip on her arm was iron tight as he pushed through the swinging doors into the dim interior. The place was quieter at this hour, just a few serious drinkers nursing their hangovers and a card game still going in the corner from the night before. Behind the bar stood Bill Morrison, a thick-necked man with cold eyes and a reputation for being as crooked as they came. He ran girls upstairs, watered his whiskey, and it was rumored he had killed more than one man who crossed him, though nothing was ever proven. "Webb," Morrison said, his voice flat, "you have got some nerve showing your face here. You owe me $60 from last week's game." I know," her father said, his voice taking on a wheedling tone that made Sarah's skin crawl. "But I have got a proposition for you. A way to settle accounts and then some." Morrison's eyes slid to Sarah, and she felt his gaze crawl over her like something oily and wrong. She instinctively crossed her arms over her chest, though her worn calico dress was modest enough, the fabric faded from too many washings. "I am listening," Morrison said slowly. "My daughter here," Marcus said, and Sarah felt the world tilt sideways. "She is a hard worker, good with a needle, can cook and clean. She would be worth her weight in gold to a man looking for a wife or someone to help run a business." "Pa, no," Sarah whispered, but he ignored her. Morrison stroked his beard thoughtfully. "I might have use for another girl upstairs, pretty enough once she is cleaned up and put in a decent dress." "I will not," Sarah said loudly, finding her voice. "You cannot make me." "Shut your mouth," her father snapped. "You will do as I say. I am your father and you will obey me." "She has got spirit," Morrison said with a laugh that made Sarah's blood run cold. "I like that. The men do too once we break them in proper." "I will give you $40, a bottle of my best whiskey, and that roan horse out front. That settles your debt and gives you $10 to boot." Sarah felt like she could not breathe. Her own father was selling her to a man who ran prostitutes, trading her for whiskey and a horse like she was livestock. She looked at him, searching for any sign of the man who had once tucked her into bed at night and told her stories, but there was nothing in his eyes but a desperate need for his next drink. "Done," Marcus said, reaching out to shake Morrison's hand. "No." Sarah tried to pull away, but Morrison moved fast for a big man, coming around the bar and grabbing her other arm. She struggled, but between the two men she was helpless. "Pa, please, you cannot do this. Ma would be ashamed of you." For just a moment, something flickered in her father's eyes, but then it was gone. "Your ma is dead," he said flatly, "and I need to survive. You will be fine. Morrison will take care of you." "Like hell he will." A new voice cut through the saloon and everyone turned. The man who stepped through the doorway was tall, lean, with shoulders that spoke of hard work and a face that was all sharp angles and sun-bronzed skin. He wore a dusty trail coat over a dark shirt, denim pants and boots that had seen a lot of miles. His hat was pushed back, revealing brown hair that needed a trim, and his eyes were a striking shade of blue-green that seemed to take in everything at once. A gun belt sat low on his hips, the holster tied down in the way of a man who knew how to use it. "This does not concern you, Garrett," Morrison said, his voice edged with warning. "Move along." "I am making it my concern," the man, Garrett, said evenly. He moved into the saloon with the kind of easy confidence that came from being sure of himself. "I have been in town long enough to hear about your operation, Morrison, and I do not much care for it. And I especially do not care for seeing a woman sold like a cow at auction." "Her father has the right to make decisions for her," Morrison argued. "It is legal and proper." "Legal maybe, but not right," Garrett said. He looked at Sarah and she saw something in his eyes that she had not seen in a long time. Kindness, respect. "Miss, do you want to go with this man?" "No," Sarah said, her voice shaking but clear. "I do not want this, but I do not have a choice." "Everyone has a choice," Garrett said. He turned back to Morrison. "How much did you pay for her?" Morrison's eyes narrowed. "What is it to you? Answer the question." There was steel in Garrett's voice now, and Sarah noticed that the other men in the saloon had gone very still, watching. She got the sense that this Garrett was someone with a reputation, though she had never heard of him before. $40, a bottle of whiskey and a horse," Morrison said slowly. Garrett pulled out a leather pouch from inside his coat and counted out coins onto the bar, the gold eagles ringing against the wood. "There is $60. That covers what her father owed you originally. Give him his 40, the whiskey and the horse, and we call it square. The girl goes free." "Now wait just a minute," Marcus protested. "That is my daughter. If someone is buying her, I should get the money." "You already got your payment," Garrett said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. "You sold your own flesh and blood for a bottle and a horse. Take Morrison's deal and get out of my sight before I forget I am trying to be civilized about this." Sarah saw her father actually take a step back. Morrison was calculating, his eyes moving between Garrett and the gold on the bar. Finally, he shrugged. "Fine. Webb, you get what we agreed." "The girl goes with Garrett." He counted out $40 and pushed it across the bar, then pulled a bottle from under the counter. "Take your payment and go." Marcus grabbed the money and bottle, not even looking at Sarah as he headed for the door. She wanted to feel something, pain or anger or sadness, but there was only a strange numbness. Her own father had not even said goodbye. Morrison released her arm and Sarah stood there, uncertain and afraid. She did not know this Garrett, did not know what he wanted from her or what he expected in return for his money. "You are free to go, miss," Garrett said gently. "I am not buying you. I am buying you away from this situation. What you do now is your own choice." Sarah stared at him, trying to understand. "Why would you do that? You do not even know me." "Because it was the right thing to do," he said simply, "and because no woman should be traded like property." He tipped his hat. "Name is Garrett Malone. I have got a ranch about 2 days' ride from here. Came into town for supplies. I will be at the general store if you need anything, and I am staying at the boarding house at the end of the street if you need help finding a safe place to stay." He turned to leave and Sarah felt panic rise in her chest. She had nothing. No money, no home, no family. The tent had been in her father's name, such as it was, and she had no doubt he would sell it and everything in it for more drinking money. She had the clothes on her back and nothing else. "Wait," she called out, and Garrett paused, turning back. "I have nowhere to go, no money, no food. I do not know anyone in this town who would help me." She swallowed hard, hating that she had to ask but seeing no other option. "You said you have a ranch. Do you need help?" "I can cook and clean, I can sew, I can work hard. I am not asking for charity, just a fair job for fair wages." Garrett studied her for a long moment, and Sarah forced herself to meet his eyes, to let him see that she was serious, that she was not some fragile thing that would break at the first sign of hardship. "I could use help," he admitted. "The ranch is just me and an old cowhand named Pete who is better with horses than housekeeping. The place is not fancy and the work is hard. But you would have a room of your own, 3 meals a day, and I would pay you $20 a month. That is a fair wage for a housekeeper in these parts." $20 a month was more than Sarah could make in 3 months of mending in Deadwood. It was also a way out of this town that had brought her nothing but misery. "I accept," she said. "When do we leave?" "Day after tomorrow." "That will give you time to settle any affairs you have got here and me time to get my supplies together." He pulled out a $5 gold piece and held it out. "For anything you need before we go, food, a change of clothes, whatever you require." Sarah hesitated, then took the coin. "I will pay you back. Not necessary. Consider it an advance on your wages." He nodded to her. "I will meet you at the general store at dawn, day after tomorrow. Do not be late." Then he was gone, the saloon doors swinging shut behind him, and Sarah was left standing there holding a gold coin and feeling like the ground had shifted under her feet. Morrison snorted. "You landed on your feet, girl. Garrett Malone has got a reputation for being straight as an arrow. He will not mistreat you." Sarah did not acknowledge him, just turned and walked out of the saloon into the bright morning sunshine. The air felt different somehow, like she could breathe deeper. She looked down at the coin in her palm, then closed her fist around it tight. The next 2 days passed in a blur of activity. Sarah went back to the tent to find her father passed out drunk, the horse tied outside and the bottle half empty beside him. She packed the few things that were truly hers, her mother's brush, a few pieces of clothing, the sewing kit she had bought with her own money. She left everything else. Let him sell it all if he wanted. She was done. She used some of Garrett's money to buy a sturdy pair of boots from the general store, a real luxury after years of wearing whatever cast-offs she could find. She also bought a split skirt for riding, a practical wool shawl, and some basic supplies including soap, a comb, and a few other necessities. The store owner, a kind woman named Mrs. Chen, threw in a battered tin cup and plate when she heard Sarah was leaving town to work at a ranch. "You take care of yourself," Mrs. Chen said, patting her hand. "And do not let the men push you around. You stand up for yourself, you hear." Sarah promised she would, touched by the unexpected kindness. She spent her last night in Deadwood at the boarding house, using the last of Garrett's advance to rent a room with an actual bed and a door that locked. She barely slept, too keyed up thinking about what lay ahead. She was leaving the only place she had known for the past 3 years, going off into the wilderness with a man she did not know. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. At dawn, she was waiting outside the general store with her small bundle of possessions. The sun was just starting to paint the eastern sky pink and gold when Garrett rode up leading a pack mule loaded with supplies and a saddled mare. "Morning," he said, dismounting. "This is Rosie. She is gentle and steady, good for a beginning rider. Have you ridden much?" "Not since I was a girl," Sarah admitted, "but I will manage. I will take it slow. It is a 2-day ride to the ranch and we will camp tonight along the way." He showed her how to mount, his hands respectful as he helped her find her seat, and then they were riding out of Deadwood as the town woke up around them. The landscape opened up as they left the town behind. rolling hills covered in prairie grass and wildflowers, with the Black Hills rising dark and forested to the west. The air smelled clean, without the smoke and filth of the mining camp, and Sarah felt something loosen in her chest that she had not realized was tight. They rode in silence for the first hour, Sarah concentrating on finding her rhythm with the horse's gait. Garrett set an easy pace, stopping frequently to let the animals rest and to check that Sarah was managing. He was polite but quiet, and Sarah appreciated that he did not press her with questions or try to make conversation she was not ready for. It was near midday when they stopped by a creek to water the horses and eat a cold lunch of bread, cheese, and dried apples that Garrett had packed. Sarah sat on a sun-warmed rock and let herself relax for the first time in what felt like years. "Can I ask you something?" Garrett said, breaking the comfortable silence. Sarah tensed slightly but nodded. "I suppose. Why did your father do it, sell you like that?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching the water burble over smooth stones. "He loved my mother more than life itself. When she died, something broke in him. He started drinking to forget the pain, and then he could not stop. After a while, the man I knew as my father just disappeared, and all that was left was someone who would do anything for the next drink." She looked up at Garrett. "I do not forgive him, but I think I understand. Grief can destroy a person if they let it." Garrett nodded slowly. "I am sorry you went through that. No one should have to watch someone they love fall apart." "What about you?" Sarah asked, surprised at her own boldness. "Why does a rancher who seems to have his life together spend $60 on a stranger?" "Because I have watched too many good people get crushed by bad situations," Garrett said. "And because I believe if you have got the means to help someone, you should." He stood, brushing crumbs from his pants. "Come on, we have got a lot of ground to cover before nightfall." They rode through the afternoon, the landscape gradually changing as they moved into more open country. Garrett pointed out landmarks, teaching her to read the land the way a sailor reads the sea. By the time the sun was lowering toward the horizon, Sarah's legs were aching and her back was sore, but she felt more alive than she had in years. Garrett made camp in a small hollow sheltered by cottonwood trees, near another creek. He showed Sarah how to build a proper fire, then went about setting up a canvas shelter for her while he would sleep under the stars. "I have got jerky and hardtack, or I can cook up some beans and bacon," he offered. "Let me cook," Sarah said. "That is what you are paying me for, after all." She took over the camp cooking, grateful to have something useful to do with her hands. She made a simple meal of beans flavored with bacon and onions, and fried up some cornbread in Garrett's cast-iron skillet. They ate sitting by the fire, the sky overhead turning deep purple and stars beginning to emerge. "You are a good cook," Garrett said, scraping his plate clean. "My mother taught me. She said a woman who could not cook was asking for a hard life." Sarah smiled at the memory. She was practical like that. Sounds like she was wise. They talked more easily after that, the darkness and the crackling fire creating a sense of intimacy that made conversation flow naturally. Garrett told her about his ranch, how he had come west from Texas 5 years ago with nothing but a horse and a dream, how he had worked as a hand for various outfits before saving enough to buy his own land and stock it with cattle. He talked about the hard winters and the summer droughts, about the satisfaction of building something with your own hands. Sarah told him about her life before her mother died, about growing up in Missouri and learning to sew and read from her mother, about the plans she had once had for her life that had evaporated when fever took her mother and whiskey took her father. "You are still young," Garrett said. "You still have time to make new plans." "I am 20, Sarah said. "That is practically old by frontier standards. Most women my age are already married with children." "Maybe, but marriage is not the only measure of a life well lived." Garrett poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the night. "My mother always said a person should marry for love or not at all. I have seen too many marriages where people were just bound together by duty and need, with no real affection between them." That seems like a special kind of hell to me. Your mother sounds like a romantic. She was. My father too, actually. They were completely devoted to each other right up until a fever took them both when I was 18. He was quiet for a moment. I think that is why I have not married yet. I am holding out for what they had. Sarah felt something flutter in her chest, a feeling she could not quite name. That is a rare kind of hope to hold on to out here, maybe, but hope is what keeps us going, is it not? He stood and stretched. We should get some sleep. We have got another long day of riding tomorrow. Sarah retired to her canvas shelter, wrapping herself in the blanket Garrett had provided. She could hear him moving around outside, banking the fire and checking on the horses. She felt safe for the first time in longer than she could remember, and she fell asleep listening to the sound of the creek and the soft sounds of the night. They set out again at first light, riding through country that grew increasingly beautiful as they went. They passed herds of pronghorn antelope, saw eagles circling overhead, and once spotted a small band of wild horses running across a distant ridge. Garrett was a patient teacher, showing her how to sit properly in the saddle to avoid soreness, how to read her horse's mood, how to spot landmarks and navigate by the sun. It was late afternoon when they crested a rise and Garrett reined in his horse, gesturing ahead. There, that is home. Sarah looked down into a broad valley where a creek wound through grassland dotted with grazing cattle. Near the creek sat a small log house with a stone chimney, a barn and several corrals. It was not grand, but it looked solid and well cared for, and the setting was beautiful with hills rising on all sides. It is lovely, Sarah said honestly. They rode down into the valley, and as they approached the house, an older man emerged from the barn. He was bow-legged and weathered, with a gray beard and sharp eyes, and he walked with the kind of rolling gait that came from spending more time on a horse than on foot. "Well, you made it back," the man called out. "And brought company, I see. Pete, this is Sarah Webb. She is going to be our housekeeper. Sarah, this is Pete Larson. He has been with me since the beginning." Pete looked Sarah over with the frank assessment of someone used to judging livestock, then nodded. "We sure could use a woman's touch around here. The place has gone to rack and ruin since we have been living like a couple of old bachelors. Welcome, Miss Sarah." "Thank you," Sarah said, dismounting with only a slight wince. Her legs felt like jelly after 2 days of riding. Garrett showed her into the house, and Sarah looked around with a practiced eye. It was a single large room with a sleeping loft above, a stone fireplace at one end, a kitchen area with a good iron stove, and a table with chairs in the middle. There was a doorway leading to what Garrett explained was a small back room that would be hers. "I know it is not much," Garrett said, looking almost embarrassed. "Pete and I are not exactly skilled at housekeeping." That was an understatement. The place was not filthy, but it was clear that no one had given it a proper cleaning in months. Dust covered every surface, the windows were grimy, dishes were piled in a wash basin, and the floor looked like it had not seen a broom in recent memory. "It is fine," Sarah said firmly. "Nothing that some hard work will not fix." Her room was small but private, with a narrow bed, a chest for her things, and a real window with glass panes. It was simple, but it was hers, and that meant everything. She spent the rest of that day and most of the next week transforming the house. She scrubbed every surface until it gleamed, washed windows until they sparkled, organized the kitchen and the pantry, and generally brought order to chaos. Garrett and Pete stayed out of her way, going about their ranch work, but she could tell they appreciated the changes. She also took over the cooking, and the men were clearly grateful for real meals instead of their typical bachelor fare of beans, bacon, and whatever game they could shoot. Sarah made stews and roasts, baked bread and biscuits, even made pies from dried apples. She took pride in her work, in earning her keep and proving she was worth what Garrett was paying her. The days fell into a rhythm. She would wake before dawn to start breakfast, feed the men when they came in hungry from morning chores, then spend her day on housework, cooking, and the endless task of keeping a frontier home running. It was hard work, but it was honest work, and for the first time since her mother died, Sarah felt like she had a purpose. Garrett was unfailingly polite and respectful, treating her like a valued employee but keeping a professional distance. Pete was gruffer but kind in his own way, complimenting her cooking and teaching her things about ranch life when they happened to be working near each other. It was a good situation, better than Sarah had any right to expect. But as the weeks passed, Sarah found herself noticing things about Garrett that had nothing to do with being employer and employee. The way he was always fair and patient with the horses, never losing his temper even when things went wrong. The way he treated Pete like an equal and friend rather than just a hired hand. The sound of his laugh, rare but genuine. The way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. The strength in his hands when he helped her move something heavy, always respectful, never presuming. She told herself she was being foolish. He had saved her from a terrible situation, yes, but that did not mean anything beyond kindness. He was her employer and she was his housekeeper. That was all there was to it. One evening in early summer, about 2 months after Sarah had arrived at the ranch, a storm rolled in fast and fierce. The sky turned an ominous green-black, and the wind whipped up strong enough to rattle the windows. Sarah had been hanging laundry when the first drops fell, and she rushed to gather it in before it could be ruined. She was struggling with a sheet that had caught in the wind when Garrett appeared at her side, helping her wrestle the fabric down from the line. Thunder cracked overhead, so loud it made her ears ring, and the rain came down in sheets, drenching them both in seconds. "Get inside," Garrett shouted over the roar of the storm, and they ran for the house. They burst through the door, dripping and breathless, and Sarah could not help but laugh at the absurdity of it. They were both soaked to the skin, her hair plastered to her face, his shirt clinging to his frame. "That came up fast," Garrett said, pushing his wet hair back. "Are you all right?" "I am fine, just wet." Sarah wrung out her hair, trying to get the worst of the water out. "I should change before I catch my death." "Good idea. I will get the fire built up." Sarah went to her room and changed into dry clothes, then came back out to find Garrett had indeed gotten a roaring fire going. He had changed as well and was standing near the fireplace, the orange light playing across his features. "Pete is staying in the barn tonight," Garrett said. "He does not like to be caught outside in lightning, and the barn is closer than running back here." So it was just the two of them, alone in the cozy house with the storm raging outside. It should not have felt different from any other evening, but somehow it did. There was a quality to the air, a sense of intimacy that had nothing to do with anything improper and everything to do with shared space and growing familiarity. Sarah made coffee and they sat at the table, listening to the rain hammer on the roof and the wind howl around the corners of the house. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and as the evening wore on, they talked the way they had that first night around the campfire, easily and honestly. "Can I tell you something?" Garrett said eventually, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "Of course. When I saw you in that saloon, saw what your father was doing, it made me so angry I could barely see straight. But it was more than just anger at the injustice of it. There was something about you, the way you held yourself even in that situation, the dignity you maintained even when you were terrified. I knew right then that you were someone special, someone worth knowing." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. "I did not feel very dignified. I felt helpless and scared. But you were not broken. That is what I saw. You were bent but not broken, and that takes real strength." He met her eyes across the table. "I have been thinking a lot over these past weeks, having you here, getting to know you. And I have to be honest with you, Sarah. My feelings have become more than just those of an employer for an employee." Sarah's heart was suddenly pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I have come to care for you, deeply. And I know this is probably not appropriate, given our situation, but I do not believe in hiding the truth." He reached across the table, not touching her but close. You are under no obligation to feel the same, and if you do not, we will never speak of this again. I will not make things uncomfortable for you, but if there is any chance that you might feel even a fraction of what I feel, I need you to know that I would count myself the luckiest man alive for the chance to court you properly." Sarah felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. She had been telling herself for weeks that what she felt was just gratitude, just the natural result of him saving her from a terrible fate. But hearing him say these words, seeing the vulnerability and hope in his eyes, she could not lie to herself anymore. "I feel it too," she whispered. "I have been trying not to, telling myself it was foolish, that you could not possibly see me as anything more than an employee you took pity on. But I care for you, Garrett, more than I should, more than is probably wise." The smile that broke across his face was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. "Then I am asking, with your permission, to court you, to see where this might lead if we give it a chance." "Yes," Sarah said, her own smile trembling on her lips. "I would like that very much." Garrett stood and moved around the table, offering his hand. Sarah took it, letting him draw her to her feet. They stood close but not touching, the air between them charged with possibility. "I will do this right," Garrett promised. "No rushing, no impropriety. You deserve to be courted like a lady, not just some frontier convenience." "I trust you," Sarah said simply, and she meant it. The storm raged on outside, but inside the little house, everything felt warm and safe and full of promise. Over the following weeks and months, Garrett kept his word. He courted Sarah with a sweetness and attention that made her feel cherished in a way she had never experienced. He brought her wildflowers from the prairie, took her on rides through the most beautiful parts of the ranch, sat with her in the evenings and talked about everything and nothing. He asked her opinions, listened to her dreams, treated her like she mattered. Pete, for his part, seemed entirely unsurprised by this development. "Saw that coming from the first day," he said to Sarah one morning while she was feeding the chickens they had recently acquired. "The way he looked at you like you hung the moon. About time that boy found someone worth settling down with." Sarah blushed. "We are just courting. It might not lead anywhere," Pete snorted. "And I might sprout wings and fly to St. Louis." "That man is head over heels, and unless I miss my guess, you are too." He was right, of course. Sarah was falling in love with Garrett Malone, deeply and irrevocably. She loved his integrity, the way he treated everyone with respect regardless of their station. She loved his quiet strength, the way he worked hard without complaint. She loved his gentleness with animals and his patience with her when she was learning new skills. She loved the way he looked at her like she was precious, like she was someone worth protecting and cherishing. By the time autumn came, painting the hills in gold and crimson, Sarah could not imagine her life without Garrett in it. They had not spoken explicitly about the future, but it hung in the air between them, a possibility that felt more inevitable with each passing day. It was a cool October evening, the kind where you needed a shawl but the air still held the memory of summer warmth, when Garrett asked her to take a walk with him after dinner. Pete made himself scarce, disappearing into the barn with suspicious speed, and Sarah felt her pulse quicken as Garrett offered her his arm. They walked down to the creek, where the water ran silver in the moonlight and the sound of it filled the air with a peaceful burble. Garrett had brought a lantern and he set it down on a flat rock before turning to face her. "Sarah, I have been thinking a lot about the future," he began, and she could hear the nervousness in his voice. "About what I want, what kind of life I want to build. And I cannot imagine any future that does not have you in it." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Sarah's breath caught as he opened it to reveal a simple gold band with a small stone that caught the lamplight. "This was my grandmother's ring. It is not fancy, but it is real and it has been in my family for 3 generations. Sarah Webb, I am asking if you would do me the incredible honor of becoming my wife. I know we have not known each other that long by some standards, but I am as certain of this as I have ever been of anything. I love you. I love your strength and your kindness and your laugh and the way you hum when you are cooking. I love how you transformed my house into a home. I love everything about you, and I want to spend the rest of my life showing you that every single day." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, but they were tears of joy, of relief, of a happiness so profound it felt almost too big to contain. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, Garrett, I will marry you. I love you too, so much it scares me sometimes. You saved me in that saloon, but you did more than that. You gave me back my life, my hope, my belief that good things can still happen. You showed me what real love looks like, what a good man looks like. I would be proud and honored to be your wife." Garrett slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made just for her. Then he cupped her face in his hands, gentle and sure, and kissed her for the first time. It was sweet and tender, full of promise and love, and Sarah felt like every hard thing she had ever endured had been worth it to arrive at this moment. When they walked back to the house hand in hand, Pete was sitting on the porch whittling, and he looked up with a knowing grin. "About damn time," he said, and they all laughed. They were married 6 weeks later in a simple ceremony in Deadwood, with Pete as witness and a few of the town's more respectable citizens in attendance. Sarah wore a dress she had sewn herself from blue calico, with lace at the collar that Garrett had ordered special from Cheyenne. She had never felt more beautiful. The ceremony was short and sweet, presided over by a traveling preacher who happened to be passing through. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, and Garrett kissed her in front of everyone, Sarah felt like her heart would burst from happiness. They held a small celebration at the boarding house, Mrs. Chen having offered her dining room for the occasion. There was food and music, and people danced and laughed, and for a few hours, Sarah let herself simply be happy without any shadow of the past creeping in. As they were preparing to leave, Sarah saw a familiar figure slumped in the corner of the saloon across the street. Her father, looking even more ragged and broken than she remembered. For a moment their eyes met, and she saw something flicker there, regret maybe, or shame. But then he looked away, taking another drink, and Sarah felt the last tie to her old life snap. "Are you all right?" Garrett asked quietly, following her gaze. "I am fine," Sarah said, and she meant it. "That part of my life is over. I have a new life now with you." Garrett pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Let's go home, Mrs. Malone, Mrs. Malone." Sarah loved the sound of that. The ride back to the ranch was cold but beautiful, the winter stars brilliant overhead. When they arrived, Pete had made himself scarce again, leaving a note saying he would be staying in town for a few days to give them privacy. The house was warm, a fire already laid in the fireplace, and someone, probably Pete, had left wildflowers in a jar on the table. Their wedding night was everything Sarah had hoped for and nothing like she had feared. Garrett was gentle and patient, taking time to make sure she felt safe and loved. He worshipped her with his hands and his mouth, teaching her the language of passion and pleasure. And when they finally came together as husband and wife, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, like two pieces finally fitting together the way they were always meant to. Afterward, they lay tangled together in Garrett's bed, which was now their bed, and Sarah felt a peace so profound it brought fresh tears to her eyes. "What is it?" Garrett asked, brushing her tears away with his thumb. "Did I hurt you?" "No, nothing like that," Sarah assured him. "I am just so happy. 6 months ago, I thought my life was over. I thought I would end up used and discarded, or worse. And now I am here with you, married to the best man I have ever known. It feels like a dream." "It is not a dream," Garrett said, holding her close. "This is real, and it is forever. I am never letting you go, Sarah. You are mine, and I am yours for as long as we both live." "I love you," she whispered into his chest. "I love you too. More than words can say." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, and Sarah's last thought before sleep claimed her was that she was finally, truly home. The winter that followed was hard, as winters on the frontier always were. Snow piled high, temperatures dropped low enough to freeze water solid, and there were days when the wind howled so fiercely that going outside was dangerous. But inside their house, Sarah and Garrett built a life together that made every hardship bearable. Sarah threw herself into making their home as comfortable as possible. She sewed curtains for the windows, braided rugs for the floors, and made quilts to keep them warm through the long, cold nights. She cooked hearty meals that stuck to their ribs and kept their strength up. She learned to make soap and candles, to preserve food for the lean times, to do all the 1,000 little tasks that kept a frontier household running. Garrett was a good husband, attentive and affectionate. He never raised his voice to her, never made her feel small or unimportant. He consulted her on decisions about the ranch, valuing her input and treating her like a true partner. He helped with household chores when he could, chopping wood for the stove, hauling water, doing the heavy work that she could not manage on her own. And at night, in the privacy of their bed, they continued to learn each other, to discover the ways they could bring each other pleasure and comfort. Sarah had been nervous at first, her only knowledge of relations between men and women coming from whispered conversations between the saloon girls in Deadwood, most of it making it sound like something to be endured rather than enjoyed. But with Garrett, it was different. He made her feel beautiful and desired, and he took as much pleasure in her satisfaction as his own. Pete returned after a few days and slipped back into the rhythm of ranch life with his usual gruff efficiency. He treated Sarah with the same respect he always had, but now there was an added warmth, an acceptance of her as truly part of the family they had built together. As winter gave way to spring, Sarah began to notice changes in her body. She was tired more often, her appetite changed, and her monthly courses stopped coming. She was not naive enough to not know what this meant, but she waited another few weeks to be sure before she told Garrett. It was a warm evening in late April, the prairie beginning to green up after the long winter, when she finally spoke up. They were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, a ritual they had fallen into whenever the weather was fine. "Garrett, I have something to tell you," she said, taking his hand in hers. He turned to her, his expression instantly concerned. "What is it? Is something wrong?" "No, nothing is wrong. In fact, everything is very right." She took a deep breath. "I am going to have a baby. Probably sometime in November if my calculations are correct." For a moment, Garrett just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then a slow smile spread across his face, growing until it was the biggest, most joyful smile Sarah had ever seen. "A baby." He repeated like he could not quite believe it. "We are going to be parents?" "Yes," Sarah confirmed, laughing at his obvious delight. "Are you happy?" "Happy." Garrett pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "Sarah, I am over the moon. This is the best news I have ever gotten. We are going to be a family." "We are already a family," Sarah pointed out. "You are right, but now we are going to be a bigger family." He pulled back to look at her, his eyes shining. "How are you feeling? Do you need anything? Should you be resting more?" "I am fine," Sarah assured him. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I am strong and I will be fine." But Garrett fussed over her anyway, insisting she take it easier, doing even more of the heavy chores himself. Pete, when he heard the news, was equally delighted and declared himself the baby's honorary grandfather. The whole ranch seemed to take on a new energy, everyone working toward the future, toward the new life that would be joining them. As summer came and Sarah's belly grew round with their child, she felt a contentment that went bone deep. She would sit on the porch in the evenings, her hands resting on the swell of her stomach, feeling the baby move inside her, and marvel at how much her life had changed. A year ago, she had been a desperate woman being sold like cattle. Now she was a wife, soon to be a mother, surrounded by love and security. The pregnancy was not without its challenges. She had bouts of sickness in the early months, and as the baby grew larger, she struggled with swollen feet and an aching back. But Garrett was there every step of the way, rubbing her feet at night, helping her get comfortable, making her feel loved and cared for. In October, as her time drew near, Garrett rode into Deadwood and convinced Mrs. Chen, who had some experience with midwifery, to come stay at the ranch for a few weeks. Sarah was grateful for the other woman's presence and knowledge. The baby came on a cold November night, 2 weeks earlier than Sarah had expected. The labor was long and difficult, hours of pain that felt like it would never end, but Mrs. Chen was calm and competent, and Garrett, though he was not allowed in the room during the actual birth as was proper, was right outside the door, his presence a comfort even when Sarah could not see him. Finally, as the sun was just beginning to lighten the eastern sky, Sarah heard the most beautiful sound in the world, her baby's first cry. Mrs. Chen cleaned and swaddled the infant, then placed the tiny bundle in Sarah's arms. "You have a son," she said with a smile. "A healthy, beautiful boy." Sarah looked down at the tiny face, red and wrinkled and perfect, and felt her heart expand in a way she had not known was possible. This was her child, hers and Garrett's, a whole new person made from their love. "Can Garrett come in now?" she asked, her voice hoarse from hours of labor. Mrs. Chen went to the door, and a moment later Garrett burst in, his face anxious until he saw Sarah holding their son. Then his expression transformed into something so full of love and wonder that Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Garrett approached the bed like he was in a church, reverent and awed. He sat carefully on the edge of the mattress and looked down at the baby in Sarah's arms. "He is so small," he whispered. "He is perfect," Sarah said. "Would you like to hold him?" With trembling hands, Garrett took the baby, cradling him against his chest with infinite care. The infant settled immediately as if he recognized his father's voice and heartbeat. "Hello, little one," Garrett murmured. "I am your pa. And I promise you right now, I will do everything in my power to give you a good life, to keep you safe and loved. You will never doubt that you are wanted, that you are cherished." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she watched her husband bond with their son. This was everything she had ever wanted, everything she had thought was lost to her forever. "What should we name him?" Garrett asked, looking up at her. "I was thinking about that," Sarah said. "What about James, after your father?" Garrett's eyes grew bright with emotion. "James Malone." "I like that, James Andrew, after both our fathers." Sarah hesitated. Her own father's name was Marcus, but he was also the man who had sold her for whiskey and a horse. She had not seen him since her wedding day, and she did not know if he was even still alive. "Are you sure?" she asked. "After what my father did, he gave me you," Garrett said simply. "Not intentionally and not in any way that deserves credit, but his actions led to us finding each other. And this little one is part of that story, whether we like it or not. Besides, it is just a name. What matters is the man our son becomes, not who he is named after." "James Andrew Malone," Sarah repeated. "It is perfect." The next few months were a blur of sleepless nights and endless feedings, of learning to care for a tiny human who depended on them for everything. Sarah was exhausted most of the time, but she had never been happier. Watching Garrett with their son, seeing the gentle way he held him, the patience he showed even when the baby was crying at 2 in the morning, fell in love with her husband all over again. Pete was besotted with the baby, often found rocking him and singing off-key lullabies when Sarah needed a break. Mrs. Chen stayed for 2 weeks after the birth, teaching Sarah everything she needed to know about caring for an infant, before returning to Deadwood with a promise to visit soon. As winter settled in again, the little house was filled with the sounds of a baby, crying and cooing and making all the small noises that announced a new life. Sarah would sit in the rocking chair Garrett had made for her, nursing James while the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, and feel a peace so complete it was almost overwhelming. One evening, when James was about 3 months old and finally sleeping through most of the night, Sarah and Garrett were able to have a quiet evening together for the first time in what felt like forever. They sat by the fire, Sarah tucked against Garrett's side, his arm around her shoulders. "I have been thinking," Garrett said, his voice quiet so as not to wake the baby sleeping in his cradle nearby, "about expanding the ranch. We have had a good year, the cattle are thriving, and I think we could handle a bigger herd." Maybe build onto the house, add another room or two for when James gets older. That sounds wonderful, Sarah said. Though I hope we fill those rooms with more children eventually. Garrett smiled and kissed the top of her head. I would like that. A whole house full of children running around, filling this place with noise and life. Do you ever regret it? Sarah asked suddenly. Taking me in, I mean. Your life was probably simpler before I came along. Garrett pulled back to look at her, his expression serious. Sarah Malone, I have never regretted a single moment since I walked into that saloon and saw you. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. You and James, you are my whole world. If I could go back and do it all again, the only thing I would change is I would have paid twice what Morrison wanted just to get you out of there faster. I love you, Sarah said, the words feeling insufficient for the depth of what she felt. I love you too, always and forever. The years passed, marked by the changing of seasons and the growth of their family. James grew into a bright, curious little boy with his father's eyes and his mother's dark hair. When he was 2, Sarah found herself pregnant again, and the following spring she gave birth to a daughter they named Emma Rose. 2 years after that came another son, William, called Will by everyone. The ranch prospered under Garrett's careful management and Sarah's hard work. They added on to the house, just as Garrett had planned, creating bedrooms for the children and a larger kitchen for Sarah. They bought more land, increased their herd, and hired 2 more hands to help Pete, who was getting older but refused to retire. Sarah sewed clothes for the children, taught them their letters and numbers, told them stories and sang them songs. She kept the house running smoothly, managed a large garden that provided vegetables for the table and preserves for the winter, and served as the unofficial doctor for the ranch, treating scrapes and bruises and the occasional more serious injury. Garrett was a devoted father, spending time with his children even when he was busy with ranch work. He taught James to ride almost as soon as the boy could walk, and Emma was not far behind her brother. He was patient with their questions, firm but fair with discipline, and always made sure they knew they were loved. Life was not without its challenges. There were droughts that tested their resources, harsh winters that took a toll on the herd, and once a prairie fire that came dangerously close to the ranch before a shift in the wind saved them. There were illnesses and injuries, the constant worry that came with raising children in a place where dangers were real and medical help was far away. But through it all, Sarah and Garrett faced everything together, their love for each other only growing stronger with time. They had built a life based on respect, partnership, and genuine affection, and it showed in everything they did. One summer day when James was 7, Emma was 5, and Will was 3, a stranger rode up to the ranch. Sarah was hanging laundry when she saw him approach, and something about the slumped figure on the old horse made her heart clench. She knew who it was even before he got close enough to see his face clearly. Her father, Marcus Webb, looking ancient and worn, his hands shaking on the reins. "Sarah," he croaked, his voice rough as gravel. "I know I have got no right to be here, but I did not know where else to go." Garrett had come out of the barn, alerted by the children who had run to tell him about the stranger. He stood beside Sarah, his hand resting protectively on her back, letting her take the lead. Sarah looked at the man who had sold her, who had chosen whiskey and a horse over his own daughter, and tried to find some feeling beyond tired sadness. He was dying, she could see that. Some wasting sickness had eaten away at him, leaving skin and bones and regret. "Why did you come here?" she asked, her voice steady. "To say I am sorry," Marcus said, tears streaming down his weathered face. "I know it does not change anything. I know I do not deserve forgiveness. But I needed you to know that I am sorry, that not a day has gone by that I have not regretted what I did. Your mother would be ashamed of me, and rightly so. I threw away the most precious thing I had because I was too weak to face my grief sober." The children had gathered behind Sarah and Garrett, sensing the tension in the air. James held Emma's hand and Will clutched his father's leg, all of them watching with wide eyes. "That is my grandfather," James said, not a question but a statement. Sarah had told her children the truth about her past, about how she came to the ranch and why. She believed in honesty, even about painful things. "Yes," Sarah said quietly, "that is my father." She looked at Marcus, at the broken man he had become, and felt the anger she had carried for so long finally drain away. She could not change the past, could not make him into the father she had needed. But she could choose what kind of person she wanted to be going forward. "You can stay in the bunkhouse," she said finally. "We will feed you and give you a place to rest, but I cannot give you forgiveness, Pa. That is going to take time if it comes at all. What you did nearly destroyed me, and the only reason I am standing here whole is because of Garrett and the life we built together." "I understand," Marcus said, more tears falling. "Thank you, Sarah. You are a better person than I ever was." Marcus stayed in the bunkhouse for 3 weeks, too sick to travel further. Sarah brought him meals and made sure he was comfortable, but she kept her distance emotionally, not ready to let him back into her heart. Garrett supported her completely, leaving the decisions about how to handle her father entirely up to her. The children were curious about their grandfather, and Marcus was gentle with them, telling them stories about Sarah's mother, about the good times before grief and alcohol had ruined everything. Sarah allowed this, wanting her children to know that there had been good in him once, even if it had been buried under years of bad choices. Marcus died on a quiet morning in early September, slipping away in his sleep. Sarah sat with him at the end, holding his hand, and felt a complicated mix of grief and relief. She grieved for the father he could have been, for the years they had lost, but she was also relieved that he was finally at peace, free from the demons that had chased him. They buried him on a hillside overlooking the valley, with a simple wooden cross marking the spot. The preacher came from Deadwood to say words over the grave, and Sarah found herself crying, not for the man he had been at the end, but for the father she remembered from childhood, before everything went wrong. "Are you all right?" Garrett asked that night as they lay in bed, the house finally quiet after getting the children settled. "I am sad," Sarah said honestly, "but I am also grateful. Grateful that I got to say goodbye, that he got to see that I turned out all right despite what he did. And grateful that I have you and our children, this life we have built. His bad choices led to good things in the end, even though that was never his intention." "You are an amazing woman, Sarah Malone," Garrett said, pulling her close. "The way you handled that with grace and compassion even after everything he put you through, I am in awe of you." "I just did what felt right," Sarah said, "and I had you beside me. That makes all the difference." The years continued to roll by, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. James grew into a young man who loved the ranch and showed every sign of following in his father's footsteps. Emma was spirited and clever, with a talent for working with horses that rivaled even Pete's. Will was the dreamer of the family, always with his nose in a book when he could get his hands on one, talking about seeing the world beyond the ranch someday. Sarah and Garrett added 2 more children to their family, another daughter named Rose and a youngest son they called Charlie. The house was full and loud and chaotic, exactly what Sarah had dreamed of. Pete eventually passed away in his sleep at the remarkable age of 78, having worked the ranch almost until his last day. They buried him next to Marcus on the hillside, and the children all cried for the man who had been their honorary grandfather. Deadwood slowly changed from a rough mining camp to a more settled town. The gold boom faded, but people stayed, building businesses and homes, creating a real community. Sarah made friends among the ranch wives and town women, and she found a sense of belonging she had never had before. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Garrett surprised Sarah with a beautiful new wedding ring to go alongside the simple band she still wore. This one had 3 small diamonds set in gold, representing their past, present, and future. "I wanted to give you something special," he said as he slipped it on her finger, "to show you how much these years with you have meant." You took a lonely cowboy and gave him a family, a home, a reason to wake up smiling every morning. You saved my life, Sarah reminded him. In every way that matters. We saved each other, Garrett corrected. We built this life together, Sarah. Every good thing we have, we made it together. They renewed their vows that day, standing in the same spot by the creek where Garrett had proposed, with their children and friends gathered around. It was a simple ceremony, but it meant everything to Sarah, a reaffirmation of the love and partnership that had carried them through everything. As the children grew older and started making their own paths, Sarah found herself with more time to reflect on her life. She thought about that terrified girl in the Deadwood saloon, certain her life was over. She thought about the cowboy who had stepped in when no one else would, who had seen value in her when her own father had not. She thought about the family they had built, the love they had nurtured, the home they had created from nothing but hard work and determination. James eventually married a sweet girl from a neighboring ranch, and they built a house on Malone land, planning to take over the ranch when Garrett was ready to step back. Emma, true to her independent nature, declared she wanted to train horses professionally and set up her own operation. Will surprised everyone by becoming a teacher, opening a small school in Deadwood and serving the growing community. Rose married a doctor and moved to Cheyenne, and Charlie followed his brother Will into education. Sarah and Garrett became grandparents, then grandparents many times over, and their home remained the heart of the growing family. Sunday dinners brought everyone together when possible, the table crowded with children and grandchildren, the house ringing with laughter and conversation. On a warm summer evening, when Sarah was 62 and Garrett was 65, they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the valley, just as they had done countless times over the decades. Sarah's hair was silver now, and Garrett's face was lined with years of sun and hard work, but when they looked at each other, they still saw the young people who had fallen in love all those years ago. "You remember the day we met?" Sarah asked, holding Garrett's hand, their fingers intertwined. "Every detail," Garrett said. "I remember walking into that saloon and seeing you, seeing the strength in your eyes even when you were scared. I remember knowing somehow that you were going to be important to me." "I thought you were crazy," Sarah admitted with a laugh. "Spending all that money on a stranger, I could not understand why you would do it." "Best money I ever spent," Garrett said firmly. "You gave me everything, Sarah, this ranch, these children, this life. You are my whole world, you always have been." "And you are mine," Sarah said softly. "You showed me what real love looks like, what partnership means, what it is to be cherished and respected. Every good thing in my life came from that day you walked into that saloon and refused to let me be sold like property." "I bought your freedom," Garrett said, bringing her hand to his lips. "And offered you my name, but you gave me so much more. You gave me a home, a family, a purpose. You made me whole." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge overhead, the same stars that had watched over them for so many years. Below them, the ranch lay peaceful in the gathering dusk, cattle settling for the night, lights beginning to glow in the windows of James and his family's house. "We built something good here," Sarah said. "Something lasting." "We did," Garrett agreed, "and it will go on after we are gone. Our children, our grandchildren, they will carry forward what we started. The love, the values, the determination to make a good life no matter what challenges come. That is our real legacy." Sarah leaned her head on Garrett's shoulder, feeling utterly content. Her life had started in pain and betrayal, but it had become something beautiful, something worth every hardship along the way. She had been traded for whiskey and a horse by a father who could not see her value, but she had been saved by a cowboy who had seen her worth and given her his name, his heart, and his whole life. "I love you, Garrett Malone," she said, "today and always." "I love you too, Sarah Malone," he replied, "forever and beyond." As the night deepened and the stars wheeled overhead, they remained on the porch, two souls who had found each other against impossible odds and built a love story that would be remembered and treasured by generations to come. The Wild West was changing, the frontier being tamed, but the love between them remained constant, a testament to the power of kindness, courage, and the belief that every person deserves to be valued and cherished. Years later, when Sarah and Garrett were both gone, their great-grandchildren would still tell the story of how they met, about the woman who was traded for whiskey and a horse, and the cowboy who bought her freedom and offered his name. They would speak of the ranch that became a legacy, of the love that built a dynasty, of the proof that even in the darkest moments, hope and goodness can prevail. But on that summer evening, Sarah and Garrett were not thinking about legacies or stories. They were simply being present in the moment, two people who had found love in unexpected circumstances and nurtured it into something that would last beyond their lifetimes. They had survived hardship and loss, celebrated joy and triumph, and through it all, they had faced everything together, hand in hand, heart to heart, building a life that was proof that love, real love, can transform everything it touches. The ranch continued to thrive through the following years. James proved to be as capable a rancher as his father, implementing new breeding techniques and expanding their operations while maintaining the integrity and values that Garrett had instilled. The Malone name became synonymous with quality cattle and fair dealing throughout Dakota Territory and beyond. Sarah spent her later years surrounded by love, her home always open to her children and grandchildren. She taught her granddaughters to sew and cook, passing down her mother's recipes and her own hard-won wisdom. She told them stories about the old days, about the wild frontier that was slowly disappearing, about the importance of standing up for yourself and knowing your own worth. Garrett remained active on the ranch well into his 70s, finally slowing down only when his body insisted. He would sit on the porch and direct operations, offering advice when asked but trusting James to make his own decisions. He took pride in watching his sons and daughters build their own lives, seeing the values he and Sarah had worked so hard to instill taking root in the next generation. On a crisp October morning, when Sarah was 73, she woke to find Garrett had passed peacefully in his sleep beside her. The grief was overwhelming, even though she had known this day would come eventually. They had been together for 51 years, more than 3/4 of her life, and she felt like half of herself had been torn away. The funeral brought family from all over. Their 5 children came with their spouses and children, and even some of the grandchildren had children of their own now. The house overflowed with people, and though Sarah's heart was breaking, she took comfort in seeing the legacy they had built together. They buried Garrett on the hillside where Pete and Marcus already rested, with a headstone that read, "Garrett Malone, beloved husband, father, and friend. A man of integrity and love." The view from that spot overlooked the entire valley, the ranch he had built, the home he had made, the legacy he was leaving behind. Sarah lived for 5 more years after Garrett's death, years she spent surrounded by her family and occupied with watching the ranch continue to grow and prosper. She wrote down her story, wanting future generations to know where they came from and how everything began. She detailed that day in the saloon, the journey to the ranch, falling in love with Garrett, building their life together through good times and bad. When Sarah finally passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78, she was laid to rest beside Garrett on the hillside. Her headstone read, "Sarah Malone, beloved wife, mother, and matriarch, a woman of strength and grace." Together, their graves overlooked the valley where they had built their life, a permanent reminder of a love story that had begun in the darkest of circumstances and bloomed into something beautiful and enduring. The ranch continued for generations, each new Malone adding their own chapter to the story, while honoring the foundation that Garrett and Sarah had laid. The tale of their meeting became family legend, told and retold around dinner tables and campfires, a reminder that sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead to the best things. That kindness matters, and that real love, the kind that weathers every storm, is always worth fighting for. The house they had built together still stood, expanded and updated over the years, but maintaining its essential character. In the living room hung a portrait of Sarah and Garrett taken on their 50th anniversary. Both silver-haired and weathered, but with eyes that still held the same love and devotion they had shown from the beginning. Visitors to the ranch would often pause before that portrait, struck by the obvious affection captured in the image, the way Garrett's hand rested on Sarah's shoulder, the way Sarah leaned slightly toward him, the soft smiles on both their faces. Their great-great-grandchildren would run through the same rooms where their children had played, would ride horses through the same valleys where Garrett had taught James to sit a saddle, would learn to cook at the same stove where Sarah had prepared thousands of meals. The family grew and spread, but the ranch remained the heart of it all, the place where everyone gathered for holidays and celebrations, where the family history lived in every board and stone. In Deadwood, now a proper town with paved streets and modern amenities, there was a small museum dedicated to the history of the area. In one display case sat a worn leather pouch and a simple gold band, donated by the Malone family. The placard told the story of how Garrett Malone had used the pouch to buy Sarah Webb's freedom from a saloon owner in 1876, and how the ring he had later given her had sealed a marriage that became legendary in the region. School children on field trips would press their noses to the glass, enthralled by the romantic story, and teachers would use it as a jumping-off point for discussions about justice, courage, and the changing rights of women through history. The Lucky Strike Saloon where it had all begun was long gone, burned down in a fire in 1889. But the spot where it had stood was marked with a plaque that mentioned it as the place where the Malone love story began, becoming an unexpected point of interest for tourists and romantics visiting the historic town. Emma Malone's horse training operation became one of the most respected in the region, and she passed her skills down to her daughters and granddaughters, creating a matriarchal line of expert horsewomen that carried Sarah's independent spirit forward through the generations. Will's school in Deadwood grew into a proper academy that educated hundreds of children over the decades, many of whom went on to become teachers themselves, spreading education throughout the expanding West. On the 100-year anniversary of Sarah and Garrett's wedding, the family organized a massive reunion at the ranch. Over 200 descendants gathered, from babies to great-great-grandchildren in their 50s and 60s. They recreated the wedding ceremony with family members standing in for Sarah and Garrett. They shared stories and memories passed down through the generations, and they celebrated the legacy of love and determination that had given them all their start. The oldest living descendant, Garrett's granddaughter Martha, who was 92, stood before the gathered family and read from Sarah's written account of her life. Her voice was thin but clear as she read Sarah's words. "I was traded for whiskey and a horse by a man who should have protected me. But I was saved by a man who saw my value when I could barely see it myself. Garrett Malone gave me his name, but more than that, he gave me his respect, his partnership, and his heart. He showed me that love is not about ownership or control, but about choosing each other every single day. Our life was not always easy, but it was always filled with love, and that made all the difference. To my children, grandchildren, and all who come after, remember this: you are worthy of love and respect. Never settle for less than someone who sees your value and cherishes it. And when you find that person, hold tight and build something beautiful together." There was not a dry eye in the gathering by the time Martha finished reading. The family stood together, multiple generations linked by blood and love, looking out over the valley that had been home to so many of them, and felt the presence of Sarah and Garrett in every breeze, every rustle of grass, every ray of sunlight. As the sun set on that anniversary celebration, as it had set on so many days in the valley, The family gathered on the hillside where Sarah and Garrett rested. They placed wildflowers on the graves, the same kind of wildflowers Garrett had once picked for Sarah during their courtship. Someone began to sing an old hymn, and soon everyone joined in, their voices rising into the evening air, a tribute and a thank you to the two people who had started it all. The legacy of that day in the Deadwood saloon in 1876 lived on, not just in the land and the buildings and the family name, but in the values that Sarah and Garrett had embodied and passed down. Hard work, integrity, compassion, standing up for what is right even when it is difficult, treating people with dignity and respect, and above all, the belief that love, real and true and deep, is the foundation upon which all good things are built. Young couples in the family, newly married or planning their weddings, would come to the ranch to hear the story from the older generations, to see the place where it all happened, to draw inspiration from a love that had endured every trial and emerged stronger. They would stand at the graves on the hillside and make their own promises to each other, to build their marriages with the same dedication and devotion that Sarah and Garrett had shown. The story spread beyond the family over the years. A novelist from back east heard about it and wrote a fictionalized version that became a bestseller. A folk singer composed a ballad about the cowboy who bought a woman's freedom and won her heart. The tale became part of the mythology of the Old West, proof that even in harsh and often unjust times, there were moments of grace and stories of love that transcended the darkness. But for the Malone family, it was not mythology. It was their history, as real and solid as the land beneath their feet. They knew the truth behind the legend, that Sarah had been a real woman facing real terror, that Garrett had been a real man making a choice that could have gone wrong in a dozen different ways, that their love had not been instantaneous or magical, but had grown through months and years of choosing each other, working together, building trust and affection into something unshakable. The ranch itself became a sort of living monument to their memory. Future generations of Malones made it a priority to preserve the original house, even as they built newer, larger homes on the property for their own families. The original structure was maintained as a museum of sorts, furnished with period pieces and artifacts from Sarah and Garrett's life. Visitors could see the rocking chair where Sarah had nursed her babies, the desk where Garrett had kept his ranch records, the bed where they had slept side by side for 51 years. In the barn hung the original bill of sale from when Garrett bought his first head of cattle, and in a frame on the wall was a faded photograph of Pete Larson, forever remembered as the honorary grandfather who had been there from the beginning. The kitchen still had the cast iron stove that Sarah had cooked on, no longer functional but preserved as a relic of the countless meals she had prepared there. As the decades rolled on into the 20th century and beyond, the world changed in ways that Sarah and Garrett could never have imagined. Cars replaced horses, electricity came to even remote ranches, and the frontier that had shaped their lives became a distant memory. But the Malone Ranch endured, adapting to changing times while maintaining its essential character and values. The family expanded into other ventures over the years. Some Malones went into politics, some into business, some into art and science and every field imaginable. But they all knew where they came from, all carried the story of Sarah and Garrett with them, all understood that they bore a legacy of courage and love that was worth preserving and honoring. On the 150th anniversary of that pivotal day in the saloon, the family gathered once more, this time including descendants who had scattered across the country and even the world. They came home to the ranch in South Dakota, to the valley where it all began, to pay tribute to the couple who had started it all. The gathering was smaller this time, the generations so far removed that many had other commitments and connections. But those who came felt the pull of history, the desire to connect with their roots and understand where they came from. They toured the original house, now carefully preserved, and they listened to the stories told by the oldest members of the family, who had heard them from their grandparents, who had heard them from theirs. They stood on the hillside at the graves, weathered stones now but still legible, and someone read again from Sarah's account. The words still resonated, still carried power, still reminded everyone present that they came from strength and love and determination. A young woman named Sarah Garrett Malone, bearing both their names as many descendants did, stood before the family and spoke. She was 25, a graduate student studying history, and she had spent years researching her famous ancestors, separating fact from legend. "What strikes me most about their story," she said, her voice carrying across the hillside, "is how ordinary they were in many ways. Garrett was not some white knight on a charger. He was a working cowboy who saw an injustice and chose to do something about it. Sarah was not a damsel waiting to be rescued. She was a survivor who had been doing her best in impossible circumstances, and she took the opportunity he offered and made the most of it. They were real people facing real challenges, and they built their love one day at a time, one choice at a time. That is what makes their story so powerful. It is not a fairy tale. It is proof that ordinary people can create something extraordinary through dedication and love." The family applauded, and as the sun set once more over the valley, they shared a meal together, multiple generations around tables set up outside, eating food prepared from recipes that had been passed down from Sarah herself. They talked and laughed and told stories, keeping the memory alive not through solemn duty but through genuine love and connection. As night fell and people began to drift toward their cars and hotels, the youngest generation of children ran through the grass catching fireflies, their laughter ringing across the valley. The scene could have been from any era, children playing while their parents watched fondly, the land eternal even as the people living on it changed with each generation. The ranch would continue, the family would go on, and the story of Sarah and Garrett would be passed down to yet another generation of children who would grow up knowing that they came from love, that they descended from people who had faced hardship with courage and built something lasting from the ashes of tragedy. In the end, that was the real miracle of their story. Not that Garrett had saved Sarah that day in the saloon, though that was extraordinary enough, but that they had taken that single moment of courage and kindness and built from it a love that would echo through time, that would shape dozens and then hundreds of lives, that would stand as testimony to the power of choosing compassion over cruelty, love over indifference, and partnership over domination. The whiskey and the horse that Marcus Webb had accepted in trade for his daughter were long since gone, lost to time and mortality. But what Garrett had offered in exchange, his name and his heart and his partnership, had grown into something that could never be traded or lost or diminished. It lived on in every descendant who carried the Malone name or the Malone values, in every person who heard their story and was inspired to be better, to love deeper, to stand up for what was right even when it was difficult. Sarah, who had once been valued at no more than a bottle of spirits and a decent mount, had become the matriarch of a dynasty. Garrett, who had simply done what he felt was right, had become a symbol of integrity and compassion. Together, they had proven that how we begin does not determine how we end, that love can heal even the deepest wounds, and that a life lived with purpose and devotion will leave ripples that extend far beyond our own years. Their story was complete, their ending as perfect and closed as any story could be. They had lived fully, loved deeply, built something lasting, and left behind a legacy that would continue for generations to come. The cowboy who had bought her freedom and offered his name, and the woman who had accepted both and given him her heart in return, had created a love story for the ages, proof that even in the hardest of times and the roughest of places, love can not only survive but thrive, transforming everything it touches and leaving the world better than it found it.